The myth at play, the oh so suitable environment. Abstract. Despite appearances, the media system in the United States is far more commercial, consolidated in ownership, with content driven advertising, and which is far more pervasive and penetrative than many realize or are made aware. It is a media environment designed specifically for the purposes of propaganda and, therefore, most suited to that function. The myth of buying power relies heavily on this media environment and thrives accordingly as a result. This point will be demonstrated via the coverage slash promotion of buying power and related subjects conducted since 2009. Keywords: journalism, media, reporting, advertising. A recent expose about the relationship between Fox News and the current White House quoted a former head of the Federal Communications Commission responding to the idea that the news channel had created the Trump presidency. Quote, as Reed Hunt sees it, end quote, said the story. Quote, Murdoch didn't invent Trump, but he invented the audience. Murdoch was going to make a Trump exist. Then Trump comes along, sees all these people, and says, I'll be the ringmaster in your circus. End quote. Mayer, 2019. The century-long construction of our media environment designed to reduce and equate citizen to consumer has made all but meaningless nominal differences in ownership with audience creation the perfect circus for buying power mythology to ringmaster. With everyone chasing the same multi-billion-dollar advertising pool, commercial media becomes more suited to those commercial interests, be they labeled black media, white, or any other. Myths, like black buying power, require the audience we have all largely become, an audience held captive from birth, and one primed for all that nicely wrapped, commercially packaged messaging. The previously mentioned fishbowl in which we find ourselves serves quite well the function of propaganda. Our creation as McLuhan's fish allows more easily our creation as an audience susceptible, prepared for, accepting, even falsely aware of the messaging impacting our daily behavior. Brand management, labeling, and an apparent endless amount of choice for our media diets has made awareness of the constructed nature of our environment more difficult to identify. But despite appearances, today, fewer own more pervasive and penetrative media power with an impact that is vastly underappreciated than at any point in human history. Nearly all we see, read, and hear is determined by corporations and slash or private equity groups, themselves interlocked and largely politically in accord with one another. It is precisely this problem, an arrangement of a commercial media environment and journalistic practice, that has aided, if not entirely, propelled the myth of buying power. In what she describes as, quote, a plague of news sources and modes of circulation, end quote, Nancy Cott has appropriately summarized the evolution of our current media environment as being developed largely over just the last roughly 25 years and in, quote, two phases, end quote. Phase one, the initial 1990s commercial capture of our national cable networks by Fox, MSNBC, CNBC, and Bloomberg. And then the second phase of the new millennium internet and social media rise of Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Most relevant here is that what Cott concludes we are left with is a kind of personalized, tailored view of the world provided for each of us in ways we have been constructed to accept. As she says, the essential network aspect of the quote, web, unquote, means that any information easily reproduces itself and generates links that connect it to similar or related information. The making and the promulgation of news are tied together perhaps more tightly than ever before, and that whatever becomes most intensely circulated and replicated through instantaneous media becomes the most pressing, quote, news, end quote. Thus, circulation makes the news more than simply transmitting it. This multiplication and fractionalization leads away from the creation of, quote, common knowledge, end quote, and toward division of the populace into, quote, niche, end quote, publics whose knowledge worlds intentionally seek replenishment from sources that reinforce accustomed attitudes and partisan leanings. Cotton, 2017. Another microcosmic example of the impact of this media environmental arrangement summarizes the issue well. A study that encapsulated the crisis in corporate controlled media was released by the Pew Center for the People and the Press in 2010. It examined in exhaustive detail the, quote, media ecology, end quote, of the city of Baltimore for 1 week in 2009. The object was to determine how, in this changing media moment, quote, original, end quote, news stories were being generated and by whom. They tracked old media and new, newspapers, radio, television, websites, blogs, even Twitter, quote, tweets, end quote, from the police department. What did they find? The first conclusion from the researchers was an unsettling one. Despite the seeming proliferation of media, the researchers observed that, quote, much of the news people receive contains no original reporting. Fully 8 out of 10 stories studied simply repeated or repackaged previously published information, end quote. And where did the original reporting come from? More than 95% of original news stories were still generated by old media, particularly the Baltimore Sun newspaper. In other words, a great many of the much heralded online sites, even some that proudly labeled themselves as, quote, news, end quote, operations, simply disseminated what was being produced by traditional old media. It gets worse. The Sun's production of original news stories was itself down more than 30% from 10 years ago and down a whopping 73% from 20 years ago. The bottom line is this. Old media outlets are downsizing and abandoning journalism, and new media are not even beginning to fill the void. McChesney, 2012. Emphasis added. Circulating stories consumed by isolated and segmented publics and without sufficient vetting make fertile ground for the development of myth into axiom. Tracking, as I have since 2009, the transmission of the myth of black buying power, it is readily apparent that Cott's, quote, knowledge worlds, end quote, are easily developed today to include significant segments of the black community who accept it without question. The two primary sources of myth, Selig and Nielsen, have their claims circulated endlessly and used to promote an economic power black people simply do not have, or at best, which cannot be conveyed in terms of buying power. Peeling back layers since 2009 has uncovered a, quote, plague of news sources and modes of circulation, end quote, which propel and protect the myth of black buying power by what is felt at times to be an impenetrable barrier. From my initial commentary, it was clear that widely reported claims of black buying power went both unchecked and were themselves contrived of some truly spurious methods. First, There was the problem of presentation. The myth that year, as is routine, was presented by a commercial press release as, quote, news, end quote. Then the African American slash Black Market Profile, AABMP, but as noted at that time, rarely is it reported by outlets carrying these press releases that their goal is to, quote, gather and synthesize the most recent findings from dozens of sources in order to help marketers communicate more effectively with these important consumer segments, end quote. And again, these claims were based on projections and wild extrapolations, like, for instance, claiming power could be associated with the amount of black people earning 50K annually finally crossing the 30% mark, when the already oddly low poverty line of 20K annually for a household of four set an artificial standard. Further, I noted then that Selig's justification for suggesting a black, quote, economic clout, end quote, was in the ability for black consumption to, quote, energize the U.S. consumer market as never before, end quote. Ball, 2009. The report will go on to further support its conclusions with equally unscientific methods. If the goal is to assess actual economic or material conditions, such as 1. Black population growth. 2. Increased job opportunities. 3. More education for Black America. 4. Only 8.1% of Black America is over 65 years of age or at, quote, career pinnacles, end quote, at which point wage increases, quote, decelerate, end quote, whereas whites are 13.5% over 65. 5. Black people spend more than, quote, non-blacks, end quote, on natural gas, electricity, telephone services, and footwear, and a higher proportion of their money on groceries, housing, and women's and girls' clothing. 6. And this author's personal favorite, that despite, quote, a substantial gap in home ownership rates, end quote, this, quote, suggests a possible opportunity for market expansion in the years ahead, end quote. Ball, 2009. What appeared at the time as an inconsistency by now is understood as inevitable. Consumer spending rebranded as, quote, economic clout, end quote, with, quote, news, end quote, of an economic power among black people defined as the ability to energize the economy is precisely what buying power as a concept was developed to do. As was previously said about GDP, to energize the economy is to enrich those who own what is purchased and does not help explain the actual condition of the purchaser. What was particularly striking at the time was that not long before the release of that particular Selig report, the Economic Policy Institute published a relatively underpromoted, circulated, or referenced report of their own describing more accurately the, quote, permanent recession, end quote, faced by black Americans, saying, even when the national unemployment picture is good, the black unemployment rate is more than twice that of the white unemployment rate. This means that in what looks like good economic times nationally, most of black America is still experiencing a recession. When white America is in recession, black America is in an economic depression. Austin, 2008. Reports like these from the EPI get far less media or press attention than do the more heavily propagated headlines professing black buying power, especially when so much of the commercial black press is involved and invested in producing those headlines and the reports they mention. Traditional class, business, or anti-labor biases in commercial media are often involved, leaving plenty of room for public relations and marketing claims such as those promoting buying power. For instance, and only related to a timeline created by my initial commentary on buying power, and not at all meant to ignore a tradition of long pre existing critical research on related subjects. Right around the time of that 2009 commentary came a report from Derek Hamilton, a well regarded economist and researcher of black economics. That report read in part that the wealth gap is the most acute indicator of racial inequality. Based on data from the 2002 survey of income and program participation, white median household net worth is about $90,000. In contrast, it is only about $8,000 for the median Latino household and a mere $6,000 for the median black household. The median Latino or black household would have to save nearly 100% of its income for at least 3 consecutive years to close the gap. Furthermore, 85% of black and Latino households have a net worth below the median white household, regardless of age, household structure, education, occupation, or income. Black households typically have less than a quarter of the wealth of otherwise comparable white households. Hamilton, 2009, emphasis added. But in a media environment where our content is largely, entirely determined by advertisers and not owners, editors, producers, and so on, there is little room for reports like those from Hamilton to be covered and discussed. Instead, more popularly covered marketing reports are promoted, supported by the commentary of many leading black spokespeople, with no investigation of the claims, their origins, or the methods used to reach their conclusions. Not long after Hamilton's report came the following from BET, a black targeting media outlet owned by Viacom, which claimed the percentage of blacks in America is growing, and so is the amount of money blacks have available to spend on goods and services, according to a study released this week. The, quote, African Americans Revealed, end quote, study, based on a BET survey of 80,000 black consumers over 18 months, showed a 10% increase in America's black population between 2000 and 2008, and 55% increase in black buying power over the same period. According to the survey, black buying power is estimated now at about $913 billion and is projected to increase to $1.2 trillion by 2013. A similar study released in November by the Selig Center at the University of Georgia estimated that black buying power would be about $1.1 trillion by 2014, with current spending power for blacks at about $910 billion. Hodges, 2010. Further, the original story's inclusion of a comment from Boyce Watkins, believed by some to be a leading economist, focusing on the black condition, as if to knowingly further concretize the myth's most dastardly claim, said of the report that, quote, unfortunately, when African Americans make money, we spend it. We don't use it to invest or produce. When we get our tax refund, we go straight to the store, end quote. Ball, 2010. On some level, it has to be considered that buying power goes unquestioned by even those who some might think should know better, in part because of the myth's longevity and its pervasiveness. In addition to the historic rise of the myth and its acceptance by the entire black political and class spectrum, the myth has garnered tremendous press coverage from within the troubled media environment, designed itself to serve interests which are the commercial and domestic equivalent to psychological worldview warfare. So, for example, from what appears to be among the first reports offered by Jeffrey Humphreys of the Selig Center in 1995, quote, Black Buying Power by Place of Residence, 1990 to 1995, end quote. Through 2018, there were more than 600 news stories carried nationally which specifically reference both, quote, buying power, end quote, in conjunction with Black America and the, quote, Selig, end quote, center. And there are many more thousands where only, quote, buying power, end quote, is mentioned, where either the reference is to Nielsen or where none is offered at all. And beyond that, there are hundreds of thousands of stories annually where buying power is discussed for what it is, a marketing reference targeting every known segment and formation of society, business, and municipality. But as it pertains specifically to Black America, that is 25 stories, minimum, carried nationally in news outlets, big and small, every year for the last 25 years, all referencing reports from Selig and, with tremendously rare exception, without a single question about the veracity or meaning of the buying power claim. Further, it is important to note that the numbers of researched references to buying power in print publications is of just that. ProQuest database searches are of mostly print publications and do not count thousands of web page references to buying power, with little evidence of any of these references offering any critique of investigation of the claim or its origins. Nor does the database track the incalculable references to buying power made in speeches, sermons, activist meetings, and other forms of media, radio, or video productions. As it pertains to the Black press, both presses owned by Black people or which target Black audiences, one of the more popular outlets, The Root, described as one of three, The Griot and Blavity, quote, digital outlets which have some of the highest readership numbers among millennials and Generation Z age groups, end quote. The only identifiable critiques of buying power are in two pieces which reference me or my work. Brannigan, 2018. As for the National Newspapers Publishers Association, NNPA, quote, the more than 70-year-old trade association for America's Black press currently lists 158 members, representing 205 publications across 29 states and the District of Columbia, end quote, whose collective reach is, quote, more than 20.1 million readers per week. And NNPA papers online garner 35 million page views per month on social media, end quote, have no identifiable coverage or inclusion of critique of the concept. Of course, as discussed, the NNPA helps produce buying power reports. However, what is also demonstrated by the NNPA's relationship to the construction of buying power reports and the subsequent form taken by commercial press coverage of their claims are the broader historical concerns surrounding commercial interests taking precedence over journalistic ones. For another example, in 2013, I was contacted by Stacey Brown, reporting then for the Washington Informer, an NNPA member, and asked about my work on buying power. After the story's publication, I wrote Mrs. Brown and mentioned one or two errors in quoting me. But as I said, my only issue is that you didn't leave room for any of the studied critique of how they reach these really misleading numbers, which makes my quote about a system seem like just talking. You don't link to my piece or reference any of the real research I put in to debunk the numbers these, quote, studies, end quote, keep claiming. This leads to more confusion about how poverty works, and you end up supporting the myth that we just spend ourselves out of opportunities. Even as you quote accurately, studies that demonstrate how Black homes are purposely devalued, which exposes the lie that poverty is anything but the result of intentional discriminatory practices against Black and poor people. Deadlines, editors, etc. I get it, but I do admit to having had higher hopes. Brown's response, quote, Doctor, my intention certainly was to properly represent your thoughts. I will review with my editor as originally much of your comment, end quote. Ends abruptly there. 10 minutes later, she added only, quote, much of your comments were redacted, my sincere apologies, end quote. The story itself has been removed from the website. But Brown was back again recently with a piece for the NNPA Newswire, albeit titled with a bit more accuracy, quote, "Marketers should show more respect for the black consumer, according to a report," end quote. Within the article, Brown references, again, uncritically, another Nielsen executive and her claim of the, quote, $1.3 trillion, end quote, in buying power. Brown, 2019. Shortly thereafter, another similar press encounter occurred, this time within the white mainstream. Popular repetition of the myth, without attribution, explanation, or investigation of the claims, occurs nearly without exception, allowing both commercial black and white presses to promote the myth over historic or existing criticism and for their own overlapping political and economic interest. This was indeed the case again in February of 2014 when National Public Radio's Marketplace contacted me to discuss buying power in light of yet another reported claim of its existence and increase. As had happened before and since with various media outlets, I was initially invited to give a pre recorded interview about black buying power, but was not told of any other guest or what they might say. As it turned out, my comments were cut short, and more time was made for Cheryl Pearson McNeil, a senior vice president at Nielsen, who was there to talk about their own report, Lazarus 2014. For McNeil, buying power meant an odd mixture of reality and myth. That is, on the one hand, she was right when claiming buying power is evidenced in the appearance of more black people in commercials. This, of course, is where the myth of buying power originates in advertising and marketing campaigns, targeting black consumers to transfer their dollars to the sellers, owners, and producers of those goods and services, some black, but mostly white companies. But McNeil also, on the other hand, took up the mythic or fallacious side as well and argued that these overtures by white companies in advertising to black consumers was an extension of the boycotts, sit-ins, and other general work for those like Dr. King. The interview was taped in February, after all. Hers was a continuation of a tradition or pattern of having commercial forms or definitions of buying power be those that supplant historic or contemporary critique. McNeil, of course, did not discuss Dr. King's increasing radicalism, frustration with the lack of progress of boycotts and nonviolent protest, or his evolving preference for socialism, or at minimum, massive government intervention in the redistribution of wealth. McNeil did not raise King's own published and previously mentioned critique of buying power, or his clear condemnation of consumerism as a pathway to equality. This demonstrates the power of propaganda and the myth's propulsion via both the myth's creators in commercial media and the myth's more easily and broadly digestible inherent politics. Timely it was then again that, not long after, May of 2014, the Pew Research Center put out their report demonstrating another of the myth's more misleading components, one accepted just before by McNeil herself. For instance, as we have seen, both Nielsen and Seelig based their claims largely on, quote, estimates, end quote, and, quote, projections, end quote, often connected to spending patterns with claims that black consumers spend more than other communities on low-level goods like electronics, clothing, and personal care items, and that this translates to power. It is one more reflection back to the origins of the myth and a focus on black consumers preferring name brand items, which can demonstrate an overt societal advance. In other words, black people want to look good, so, as the marketing argument goes, it is to that reality that advertising should be directed. But as Pew showed, the cost of those very base and easily accessible items continue to plummet, while the cost of life-saving and altering healthcare, education, and childcare have all, quote, soared, end quote. D. Silver, 2014. Of course, then, people buy what they can afford, have access to, or items for which they have been given specific credit. The practice of journalism has always involved forms of political, ideological, and commercial struggles, and it has not gone unnoticed that one feature of those contests is those which involve class or labor. The need for commercial presses to generate as much revenue from the business ad buying community has often set limitations on how much and from which frame issues of finance and labor are covered. One outcome of this arrangement is that often these issues are reported from the perspective of business leadership or the commercial class, leaving not a lot of room for nuance, depth, but plenty for the big headlines and easily repeated simplifications or myths. And when it comes to buying power and the 20 plus years of its claim being reported unchecked, it becomes much faster for journalists to, at best, repackage, rewrap, and deliver again. In September of 2014, having little time and a structured biased disinterest in covering what is too far beneath the surface, the claim that Black America somehow equates to other national economies grabbed headlines again. Only this time, I was contacted and could experience firsthand the immaterial forces at play impacting the final reported outcome. Larry Elder, a veteran Black conservative political pundit, while engaged in a back and forth with the then CNN host Mark Lamont Hill, and in what was an odd buying power twist, used the myth as it was originally intended, as evidence of an absence of societal racism. In their argument over police violence in Ferguson, Missouri, Elder claimed that media were taking political advantage by over dramatizing what is, to him at this point, a diminished or ineffectual, leftover kind of racism, nothing like what used to exist. Upward mobility was not an issue as much as, again, Black people simply not taking better advantage of what are endless possibilities. He went on, quote, "This is what happens in America," quote, Elder said, quote, "If Black America were a country, it would be the 15th wealthiest country in the world. For crying out loud, this is not our grandfather's America, and we ought not act like it is." End quote. Saying, 2014. Pundit Fact contacted me regarding Elder's claim, and their investigation provides a really nice example of the process described thus far. My comments would not make the final published story. Only reference to my work would be noted, a point I raised in a post publication email exchange with its author. I wanted to point out that while their story concludes that Elder's claim must be rated as, quote, false, end quote, they do so at the expense of what actually made it so. My argument was, slash, is, that buying power is not a concept based in factual data or numbers, but extrapolations of spending which does not explain or demonstrate the real economic condition of the consumers. Elder's regurgitation of the old national GDP comparison is without merit in that, first, again, the numbers claimed regarding buying power are not tied to any actual measurement. Secondly, GDP does not detail inequality within an economy. And importantly, Black people do not collectively hold power over the supposed collective sums they spend with an ability to use those funds as they choose. And, as previously noted, GDP does not explain a national relationship to a global economy, that is, colonial relationships. What ultimately results from such claims are attitudes that Black people remain unequal as a result of their own poor decision making. Pundifat agreed with the fundamental critique of GDP as an inappropriate method for determining the condition of individuals or groups within a given economy, but only spoke with an economics professor at NYU who suggested they use per capita income instead, and not that they challenge or even investigate the claim of buying power or comparisons between Black spending and national economies. What made the claim, quote, false, end quote, for Pundifat in the end was merely that Elder got his placement of Black America wrong. First, they note that by his own calculations, Black people would have ranked, quote, 16th, end quote, rather than 15th. But that using the suggested per capita income approach concluded that the ranking would really be, quote, 44, end quote. My discussion of the numbers themselves being false, misused, or poorly interpreted, or that buying power is altogether just a marketing tool for advertising purposes only, all were omitted, and yet much remains revealed. First, and for instance, the Pundifat story shows some of the previously discussed process. As they would write, quote, Elder referred us to an annual report by Target Market News called The Buying Power of Black America, which publishes the only estimate we could find of the total earned income of African Americans. In 2011, the report he provided us, Target Market News, put the income spent by African Americans at $836 billion, end quote, saying 2014. Immediately, the piece demonstrates the transmission of what is initially a claim of the black commercial media business class whose interests are capturing more advertising revenue by promoting to white corporations a fantasy of black economic potential through a black media outlet, Target Market News, and black political punditry, Elder, carried out via mainstream white commercial media to the world, CNN. Secondly, by conflating, as is done just above, quote, total earned income, end quote, with, quote, income spent, end quote, and calling that, quote, $836 billion, end quote, buying power for comparison to other national economies, GDP shows, once more, the limitations of the method. Saying that black people literally spend every penny they earn is somehow to be considered, quote, power, end quote, can only confuse. Of course, this is not, for Pundifat, what makes the claim, quote, false, end quote. Only the poor placement on the GDP depth chart. As the story's author wrote me in response, my editor and I thought it would be demonstrative to carry through the per capita calculation to show that there was more wrong with Elder's statement statistically than just the buying power equals GDP distinction. I also figured that the 44th for, quote, Black America, quote, versus 7th for America overall was a good way of demonstrating inequality without pontificating too much on the issue. We're not revising so much as pointing out an addition flaw with Elder's point, besides the buying power equals GDP. Emphasis added. What is shown here is how the imposition of buying power into the conversation powerfully limits analyses and interpretation. The author demonstrates an intense contradiction by saying, on the one hand, that one should not use GDP to study the condition of a community, but then uses the per capita figure to put black people right back on that GDP scale, only with a more, quote, accurate, end quote, and lower ranking. This adjustment of chart position is considered a, quote, good way, end quote, to, quote, demonstrate inequality, end quote. Not only does this continue to reaffirm the use of a GDP scale, but most importantly, continues to accept buying power as a concept, and worse than that, reifies the myth of an economic or political agency that does not exist. By suggesting, even at a lower rank, that black collective earnings can be equated to national policy decisions regarding national economies is misleading. To suggest, as buying power does, that black people can make collective decisions about their consumption in such a way as to equate them with national economies or enormous sums of private wealth is, again, a distortion. What makes Elder's claim, quote, false, end quote, is its inherent acceptance of buying power and its mythological, political, ideological, Tentacles of distorted economic realities, potential, or the residence of real wealth, and the role public policy plays in determining that address. In September of that same year, 2014, I co hosted an interview with economist Dean Baker of the Center for Economic Policy and Research and Janet Huezo of United for a Fair Economy, UFE, who had conducted workshops in conjunction with that year's report. Quote, Healthcare for whom? Enduring racial disparities, end quote. The purpose of that interview was to primarily engage the two on their work and to show existing overlaps in that work as they relate to the actual economic condition of people within the United States. My other primary interest was to ask them about buying power. Each demonstrated how their own work, without particular intent to do so, challenges or discredits the myth of consumption as a means to achieve equality. My role then, as radio host, also, beyond the wonderful ability to produce and select guests, allowed me to take the opportunity to ask each about how their work related to my own on buying power. In each case, the guests were incredulous at the idea that buying power is anything other than false representation of economic realities. Neither were particularly familiar with the myth itself, but neither were also, given their areas of expertise, Baker, general national economics, and Uezo, the specific conditions of Black and Latino workers, convinced that such power could exist or be described as such. Baker recognized the histories of oppressed groups making use of boycotts and having Black, as he said, quote, purchasing power, end quote, affect some change. But he also acknowledged that as being, quote, limited, end quote, in its impact and as having nothing to do with redistribution of wealth or the closing of income gaps. In fact, Baker said that buying power and boycotts have, quote, little to do with the overall economic state of the African American community in the United States, end quote. Huezo, for her part, made clear that these concepts have nothing to do with broader myths of gender and racial groups closing gaps and detracts from the, quote, real thing of inequality, end quote. Fall 2014. 2015 began with more interesting news regarding a critique of buying power's myth. The global poverty and justice group Oxfam released a report in which they argued that by 2016, quote, the combined wealth of the richest 1% will overtake that of the other 99% of people next year unless the current trend of rising inequality is checked, end quote. Oxfam International, 2015. It was my argument then that, though this report was not specific to buying power or Black economics per se, that Black buying power must be reconsidered once more in light of a global economic reality which was witnessing such massive transfers of wealth upward. In other words, where is power to be derived by consumption in such an increasingly unequal world? But such questions struggle for answers in a media marketplace or public sphere so dominated by the precise kind of article which would appear just 4 months later in the Washington Informer, a prominent Black press outlet, titled, quote, The Solution for Blacks, end quote. The article was representative of press coverage of related matters and showed again the myth's function and impact. Its argument: there is nothing but Black financial illiteracy impeding progress, and, quote, the solution, end quote, is for Black people to become, quote, successful American capitalists, end quote. What's wrong with Black Americans is our lack of accomplishments and understanding of collective capitalism. Blacks here bill themselves as, quote, the richest in the world, end quote, but our status may be comparable to that of being the, quote, brightest kids in the dumb row, end quote. Whites' median household worth is 12.9 times that of Black households, $141,900 to $11,000. It's become commonplace that the annual state of Black America is always, quote, bad, end quote, or worse. The solution for the plight of blacks in America will not come from whites, but from within. The key for blacks is for us to become, quote, successful American capitalists, end quote. Read 2015. And more specifically, blacks must develop habits to, quote, buy black, end quote, bank black, end quote, and use political power collectively to promote black based and oriented issues and legislation. First and foremost, blacks' habits and mindsets must change. According to a 2007 study performed by the Selig Center for Economic Growth, African American buying power totals $1.1 trillion. Factor in our income, and American blacks are the 20th, quote, richest nation, end quote, on the planet. So, why doesn't each of us make a resolution to, quote, buy black? Each black household should make at least a monthly commitment to make a $100 or more purchase of gasoline, groceries, liquor, clothing, dry cleaning, furniture, recreation, dining, etc., from a black merchant. End quote. Read 2015, emphasis added. But this was merely one of at least 19 more national print news items just in 2015, which reference buying power connected specifically to the Selig Center's claims. If the ProQuest search variables are changed to, quote, buying power, end quote, and, quote, African American, end quote, more than 130 newspaper and magazine results return. These are just print journalism numbers for one calendar year, January 1st, 2015 through December 31st, 2015, and do not count references made in radio, television, podcasts, web videos, activist meetings, or pulpits. In fact, in fact, another of those national news items came just 1 month later during Black History Month. Nielsen produced a fresh video promoting their, quote, conscious consumer, end quote, campaign, featuring black millennials excitedly describing how their buying power was a reflection of an advancing black consciousness and pride. The video performs with near perfection the previously described goal of redefining, quote, black power, end quote, as commercial consumption or shopping. The objective could not be more overtly expressed than it was in the Nielsen video description. Nielsen is honoring Black History Month by celebrating the culture, influence, and increasingly significant role of African American consumers. In our video series, 4 millennial conscious consumers discuss their buying habits as it relates to this new, quote, black power, end quote. Check out the first video below and share your thoughts on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag conscious consumer. Nielsen 2015, emphasis added. Nixon's plan to redefine black power as black capitalism could not have found a more competent contemporary. Black control over localized, segregated black economies, no matter how flawed or limited that concept may have been/may be, or more radical forms of black power expanding to mean Pan-Africanism and scientific socialism, are old. The, quote, new black power, end quote, is spending money, even in one's own neighborhood where ownership and redistribution are not at all required. The happy, beautiful, exuberant black young women and men in the video promoted an economic power and political consciousness in stark contrast to the state of the Dream Report from United for a Fair Economy, UFE, which was released just 1 month earlier and which, coincidentally, also receives far less press coverage than do routine unfounded claims of buying power. For example, ProQuest searches returned only 3 magazine references to UFE reports since the first of their annual publications in 2004, 2 from 2012 in The Crisis and 1 in 2008 in Essence. None were about the issue of buying power. Searching Black Press USA, quote, the joint web presence of America's black community newspapers and the NNPA News Service, the last national black press news wire, end quote. There are only 6 references since 2004 to the UFE, and none since 2014, while there is a seemingly endless list of references when the search variable is changed to, quote, buying power, end quote. Beginning in 2004, UFE have produced annual detailed economic analyses of African America, demonstrating full reversals or painfully slow gains with little ultimate positive impact on the whole since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Hence the name State of the Dream. Most of what these UFE reports detail is what would be King's own often suppressed legacy of criticism of the limited progress made during the Civil Rights Movement, or his ultimate reference to his dream as having become a, quote, nightmare, end quote. Part of King's conclusion was the result of his realization by 1968 that change had been more symbolic than material and that new levels of heightened struggle would be necessary if anything more meaningful was to take place. And while Nielsen was promoting in 2015 a new black power, the quote, conscious consumer, end quote, the UFE State of the Dream report in 2015 was titled, quote, underbanked and overcharged, end quote, reflecting King's own criticism, summarized in part that dreams are powerful things. Dreams reveal that which is most human about us, our hopes, our fears, and our vision for a better tomorrow. Even though it has been 51 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously shared his dream of an America made available to all, regardless of skin color or economic status, we are still fighting for many of the same principles that the civil rights movement stood for. And many are seeing and experiencing much of the social strife that rises to the surface when people unite to challenge the status quo. We know exactly who today's dream killers are: banks on Wall Street, payday lenders, check cashers, auto title lenders, those in the student loan business, all the companies that drain the wealth of marginalized individuals in the name of profit or shareholder returns, the workers that are economically preyed upon. These dreamers deserve better. Labor, 2015. In 2013, the report continues, quote, white households had $141,900 in median wealth, while African American families had just $11,000 in median wealth, and Latino households had $13,700 in median wealth. Labor, 6. This equates to Black America having roughly 7%, or less than half, the median wealth relative to whites held in the initial UFE report from 2004. In that report, they wrote, quote, in 2001, the typical Black household had a net worth of just $19,000, including home equity, compared with $121,000 for whites. Blacks had 16% of the median wealth of whites, up from 5% in 1989. At this rate, it will take until 2099 to reach parity in median wealth, end quote. Muhammad et al., 2004. A ProQuest search for, quote, United for a Fair Economy, end quote, during the 2015 calendar year, January 1st through December 31st, returned 12 results, none from the Black press. There is less money generated for Black media owners or owners of media targeting Black consumers in discussions which reflect a much more dire economic reality, and one which, according to those same UFE reports, calls for more government, public policy solutions as opposed to a focus on spending habits. From the perspective of the state, from dominant white commercial interests, this kind of reporting imbalance serves both the earliest initial intent, at least the portion of reducing the likelihood of labor unrest, by simultaneously having the reporting and subsequent discussions of black inequality be couched largely within discussions of black self help and self imposed poverty. In August of that same 2015, Minister Louis Farrakhan, it was reported, spoke with, quote, 50 black publishers and editors, end quote, about the, quote, $1.3 trillion, end quote, in buying power black people could be spending more wisely and using 10% of which to deposit in black banks, which could then in turn be used to invest in businesses, hospitals, and colleges. Huskisson 2015. The message was similar to and tracked with the previously described precedent of using unattributed numbers as basis for grand political pronouncements, promising possibilities which do not exist. This was also another example of the implicit argument being black inequality having anything to do with bad economic habits or more wasting of opportunity. For instance, just prior to that August discussion was more reporting from Algernon Austin of the Economic Policy Institute, quote, The Cost of Being Black, end quote, 2015. Austin's was a kind of parody of the claims, indirectly associated with buying power, where, for example, the price for entrance into blackness would be $130,900, or the difference in median wealth between black and white people, or the $11,556 charge for the difference in median income, a reality where black people are twice as likely to look for jobs but not find them, or to be twice as likely killed by police, and so on. Austin, 2015. Similarly, not long after those relatively well reported comments of Minister Farrakhan was new reporting reflecting an old reality that the land he and others often recommended be purchased with a redirected buying power is already owned, 98% to be precise, by, quote, white American families, end quote. In fact, it only takes the top 5 white landowners to eclipse all the land owned, which is, quote, less than 1%, end quote, of all U.S. land by all black America combined. More, 2015, Gilbert et al., 2002. And later that same year, in December, yet another report was released demonstrating the limitations on the potential for parity, or anything approaching parity. According to the Institute for Policy Studies, one need only count the top 100 wealthiest people in the country to eclipse all the wealth held by all of black America combined. Harkinson, 2015. These comparisons are not meant to create a false standard of whiteness or material definitions of success. The contradistinctions find their greatest value in demonstrating what potential there is or is not. Tremendous accumulation of percentages of land, wealth, stock, as will be discussed below, and other assets, including income disparities and previously described penalties for blackness, such as over-policing, also limit potential. One cannot buy land that is already owned and not for sale, even if one could theoretically afford its value. Further, these are the precise disparities the initial BLS studies were meant to balance. The origins of buying power in, quote, cost of living, end quote, surveys by the Bureau of Labor Statistics were meant to ease potential social unrest by alerting workers what their wages were actually worth in the national economy and making business and government aware to manage those wages and the prices of available goods to assure labor could afford products brought to market. This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the myth in its current form. Now, black buying power is used to compel black working people that persistent, even worsening inequality is correctable by redirecting a non existent pool of wealth into an equally non existent place within the national economy. Interestingly, Labor Day in 2016, as would be the case almost exactly 1 year later, brought fascinating but underreported stories which indirectly dispelled the myth of black all buying power and directly challenged the repeated claims that black people could better use their incomes to improve their communities. During their special in 2016 for Labor Day, Counterspin, the radio component to fairness and accuracy in reporting, FAIR, discussed with Holly Sklar of Business for a Fair Minimum Wage the growing concerns among corporations that working people could no longer afford to buy their products. In fact, Sklar, by properly contextualizing buying power, actually exploded its mythology. The biggest thing businesses have complained about in recent years is that they're just not seeing enough consumer demand. They're not seeing enough consumer buying power. They need more. You know, you need people to buy what they are making in order to sustain the business and to grow the business. And there's obviously a direct connection. I say obviously, but folks like Donald Trump ideologically don't want to see it as obvious. You need people to have enough wages to be able to buy what they need. And if you are going to have a growing middle class, you need people to be able to buy more than just the bare necessities, right? And that's what we've lost sight of. Jackson, 2016, emphasis added. The problem for companies is actually and increasingly such that, in an almost perfectly beautiful and symmetrical contradiction, they have become victims of their own messaging. The propaganda promoting a mythological buying power is actually beginning to negatively impact those for whom the myth was originally intended. The companies seeking best use for their advertising dollars. People are not earning enough to buy all that they help produce, and which the companies selling those products need bought. The heavy promotion of the myth of buying power increases ad expenditures, which increase sales expectations. And those expected sales are, of course, driven up to match the advertising dollars, spent largely as a result of the promise of power held among those targeted by those ads to buy what is sold. As Charles Mills once wrote of white supremacy, the fantasies created by racism or advertising invent, quote, an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, a particular pattern of localized and global cognitive dysfunctions, which are psychologically and socially functional, producing the ironic outcome that whites, marketers, will in general be unable to understand the world they themselves have made. End quote. Mills, 1997, 186. Worse still, from the standpoint of those spending advertising dollars, Labor Day 2017 featured venture capitalist Nick Hanar saying on national public radio that the country had already reached the point where Starbucks employees are not currently paid enough to afford Starbucks coffee. An imbalance he assured means, quote, the pitchforks are coming, end quote. Johnson 2017. Hanar was very clear. He is no socialist revolutionary. Capitalism, as a multi-billionaire venture capitalist, is good for him, for now. His concern is that, as was put by Sklar, there is not enough buying power, meaning people cannot afford the lifestyles promoted to them and for which they work and work hard. As was precisely the initial purpose of the BLS reports, the concern for Hanar is that when countries become, quote, radically and unjustifiably unequal, end quote, either there is, quote, revolution or a police state, end quote. Hanar, while being clear not to equate his position with socialism, did say that those like him who are in power must raise the minimum wage closer to $21 an hour and dismiss as a, quote, trope, end quote, The claim of his elite colleagues who argue that raising wages, quote, kills jobs, end quote. Quote, capitalism, end quote, he went on, quote, is a good system or it's not, end quote. It can either allow working people to, quote, lead stable and dignified, secure lives, end quote, or it needs to be replaced. He, of course, does not want that. What he does want, what benefits his class most, hearkening back to Bernays, is a, quote, secure middle class and a stable democracy, end quote. This, he says, demands strong buying power. But it is also, as Sklar and Hanna made clear in two consecutive Labor Day media specials across multiple platforms. Buying power is the ability of consumers to purchase what is made available to them by those who own their means of production. More importantly, as both stories demonstrate well, buying power is defined by dollar value, the ability of corporations and marketers to extract whatever dollars exist for their own enrichment or advanced influence. Hanar spoke in more stark and direct terms, reflecting his own class biased concerns, and specifically for his own safety. But each, he and Sklar, were similarly clear that there is a growing concern among the wealthiest that an insufficient buying power will threaten their position in society. This, maybe more than any other, is the most provocative evidence against any claim that buying power reflects a real racial, class, societal balancing of power. Black buying power cannot mean or reflect the possibility black people have to overturn existing inequality, as it is literally a measurement of the ability of black people to enrich a minuscule black bourgeoisie en route to truly helping a far more prominent and mostly white power structure further enrich and protect itself. Consistent with previous critiques of a black bourgeoisie promoting buying power for its own interest, is the black press reporting of those claims as a matter of pride. Not long before Hanner's clarion call to his own classmates, the black press was championing buying power as driving diversity in hiring, individual gains used to convince the collective of an illusion. That such stories target black women specifically is of particular concern given the consistently precarious economic condition facing this group. Consider, in 2017, quote, the median annual earnings for full-time, year-round black women workers was just over $36,000, an amount 21% lower than that of white women, end quote. Banks, 2019. Further, collectively, quote, the immense disparity in wealth between white and black households has reached its highest level since 1989. For every dollar of wealth owned by the typical white family, the median black family owns only 5 cents. And for black women, levels of education, experience, and age to not come with commensurate levels of pay or access to wealth, and at its most extreme, quote, black single mothers experience the largest wealth disadvantage with a median wealth of zero, end quote. But these realities are less identifiable when so much black press promotes stories telling of something a bit more mythological, exemplified that later that same year, July of 2017, in a story about Lisa Brown, the diversity and inclusion consultant for Volkswagen Group of America. As the story concludes, quote, I've been with Volkswagen for 18 years and worked in after sales as an operation manager, end quote, said Brown. Quote, I was the first female of color and only the second woman who held that position, end quote. Brown continued, quote, now there are a lot more women in the region teams. When I started, there were one or two, and now there are 3 or 4 women per region and 5 women in our leadership executive position, end quote. Along with increasing the amount of women in leadership and the workforce at Volkswagen, the company has also partnered with organizations and universities to ensure that the company has access to a highly qualified and diverse talent pool. Brown stated, quote, "We have partnered with the School of Business at Howard University, the National Black MBA, both the DC and Detroit chapters, and Inroads Inc. We also have an executive mentoring program for women." End quote. Brown said that because of the strong buying and consumer power in the African American community, African Americans must be conscious of how inclusive these companies are. Due to the fact that the black community has such strong buying power, the automotive industry must cater to the black demographic, Brown added. Companies need to market to the African American community and have African American leadership, said Brown. Brown continued, quote, "There's a value and appreciation for understanding the partnerships we can create, and we have to make sure we have a direct link to the African American community." End quote. Stone, 2017, emphasis added. Again, buying power is represented here in its reality, in that it is used to redefine, quote, cater, end quote, as individual hires of black executives in the capture of more black customers for Volkswagen. The myth is also represented insofar as buying power is conveyed as an economic strength of the black communal whole. Fitting, too, is that the Jay-Z's 444 was released that same month, July 2017, where it also recirculated the myth, as was reported. Jay-Z summons black people in general to stop thinking as mere consumers and capitalize on the staggering buying power by supporting our own. Quote, "What's better than one millionaire? Two." End quote. Jay-Z said on Family Feud, quote, "Especially when they from the same hue as you." End quote. He continues as he tells them to buy black and build black. Vaughn, 2017, emphasis added. Later that same year, in September, it would again be the black press, either owned or targeted, and this time, the griot, making reference to Nielsen, extolling the virtues of black women and hashtag black girl magic, but only to the extent that these women drive sales for jewelry, social media, and their ability to run businesses and be brand loyal. 2017. The old trope of black brand loyalty is represented here as somehow new, as black women, quote, increasingly, end quote, demonstrate their fidelity to products. And black women are credited with advancing as business owners despite more sound research, which demonstrates that most have no paid employees and are run as an alternative to what would otherwise be unemployment. For instance, it has been reported in 2012 that all told, quote, 2.5 million black owned businesses had no paid employees, an increase of 38.9% from 2007, end quote, Andrews 2018. Instead, so much more, this time with news of a Black Wall Street app and claims that it would direct all the black buying power to these black businesses, which in turn would, quote, stabilize communities by providing jobs, paying taxes, and keeping money in the community where they live, end quote. Rosales, 2017. There are many other associated fantasies packaged in claims of dollars circulating in communities, or, quote, keeping money in the community, end quote. Among others would be the fantasy that there are enough black owned businesses in black communities large enough to serve the consumer needs and wants of that community. Again, buying power is a concept developed by advertisers for advertisers, where the goal is not to have money remain in any given community, but to move from that community into the pockets of the advertisers and the owners of the products being marketed. The goal, as Nielsen points out, is that notice be taken by corporations of the power black people have to make them more money. Companies should take notice of even the subtle shifts in spending, because black consumer brand loyalty is contingent upon a brand's perception as authentic, culturally relevant, socially conscious, and responsible. Nielsen 2018. The, quote, power of black dollars, end quote, is in their ability to flow outward. There are few black owned companies and less capital in black communities to develop them large enough to serve black consumer needs. Buying power does not represent the potential within any community to develop business, procure assets like land or stock, or to invest in any developmental programs. Buying power represents the outflow potential to enrich owners of companies large enough to serve national populations. Finally, even when the black press gets part of the equation correct, their frame or interpretive lens has already been preset to formulate a terribly flawed conclusion. At the end of 2017, Black Enterprise magazine ran a rare commentary which began with the correct, quote, Black buying power is not a measure of real wealth, end quote, Edmund 2017. But from there, and the accurate assertion that income is not the same as wealth, the article returns to form and even demonstrates its own contradictory logic. After the promising distinction being made between income and wealth, the article somehow argues then that what needs to happen is that black people move from lifestyles of, quote, poverty creation, end quote, to, quote, wealth creation, end quote, and bases this solely on the associated buying power tropes of saving, spending less on frivolity, and more on, quote, appreciating assets, end quote, like stock. But, as mentioned, people buy what is available to them for purchase, and in this case, as was previously described regarding land, there is no stock available for purchase, even for those who may be able to afford some. In terms of types of financial wealth, in 2013, the top 1% of households had 49.8% of all privately held stock, 54.7% of financial securities, and 62.8% of business equity. The top 10% had 84% to 94% of stocks, bonds, trust funds, and business equity, and almost 80% of non home real estate. Since financial wealth is what counts as far as the control of income producing assets, we can say that just 10% of the people own the United States of America. See Table 3 and Figure 2 for the details. The only category which is not skewed severely toward the upper class is debt. Domhoff, 2017, emphasis added. If 1% have nearly half of all the stock, and the top 10% have 84% to 94% of stocks, bonds, trust funds, and business equity, end quote. What is left for purchase? Similarly, the Black Enterprise piece answers its own contradiction and, in many ways, amplifies the entire argument over buying power, as the piece claims. By the way, as of the 2010 U.S. Census, there were 42 million black people in America, including multiracial African Americans. That means $1.2 trillion equates to about $28,600 in spending power per person. Edmund, 2017. This previously discredited formula simultaneously, dangerously misleads, adds to the myth's propulsion, and also demonstrates the myth's flawed logic. If black median household income has only just reached $41,511 in 2018, Barub 2019, it makes impossible the figure quoted above, $28,600 per person in, quote, spending power, end quote. First, of course, of the 40 plus million black people, not all are working age or have their own income revenue. Secondly, the $1+ trillion figure is itself a figment, as previously described, of marketer imagination, survey data extrapolation, and curious math. What is evident here, again, is the power of the myth to create false realities and frames of reference from which proceed the most flawed arguments and conclusions. If the median household income is not quite 42K annually, how then could it be described as, quote, power, end quote, that each person would be said to then be spending nearly all they make?